If you farmed the Canadian prairies in the last 60 years, you knew the name Degelman, the rock picker that cleared your headland of the boulders the ice left behind, the dozer blade that opened your road in a January blizzard, the heavy steel that didn't bend when the imports did. The Regina plant runs 3 shifts and ships to 7 continents. Over 500 people work there. They survived 21% mortgages, survived the 74% collapse in combine sales that took Massey Ferguson and co-op implements, survived free trade, survived NAFTA, watched Morris of Yorkton close in 2020, watched Leon's close in 2024. And then, 63 years after that first machine left a Raymore barn, they were still building. How does one prairie family outlast nearly every rival in its industry? What was built in that barn? Chapter 1. The Stone Boat. The story begins in a field 110 kilometers north of Regina, in the Touchwood Hills district, where the soil is mostly black loam over glacial till, and the wind comes off the lakes carrying the smell of slough water and stubble. The field belonged to a young farmer named Wilf Degelman. The year was somewhere in the late 1950s, and Wilf was doing the worst job on any prairie farm. He was hand-picking rock. If you grew up on the prairies, your grandfather did this. Maybe your father, maybe you. The summer fallowed field would be worked through the spring, and every pass of the cultivator would bring more of them to the surface. Field stones, boulders, the smaller cobbles that could be lifted by a man, and the larger ones that needed two. A horse-drawn drag pulled along the headland. A stone boat, a low wooden sled, sometimes built from old barn boards, dragged behind the team. You walked beside it, bent at the waist, and you lifted and you threw, and the stone landed in the boat with a sound that prairie children remember even now. That hollow thud of rock against weathered plank, the boat shifting on its runners under the new weight. By the time Wilf was working the family land at Raymore in his late 20s, the horses were gone. The tractors had arrived. The stone boat was being dragged behind a Ford, or a John Deere, or a Cockshut, a tractor built in Brantford, Ontario, 2,000 kilometers east, by men who had never picked a Saskatchewan rock in their lives. The boats themselves were sometimes steel now, welded up in farm shops. But the work hadn't changed. You still walked the headland. You still bent at the waist. You still lifted, and threw, and lifted again. There's an old prairie saying that goes around the coffee shops in places like Raymore, and Yorkton, and Watrous. This country grows rocks nearly as well as it grows wheat. It isn't a joke. Every spring, the frost in the soil heaves new ones up from below. Stones that nobody put there. Stones that nobody ever quite gets rid of, no matter how many summers you spend dragging the boat. Older farmers used to say the rocks were proof that God had a sense of humor. Younger ones, by the 1950s, were starting to say something else, that there had to be a better way. Wilf Degelman was one of those younger ones. He was a self-taught welder by then, big-shouldered, broad-handed, with what his sons would later call little formal education, in design and drafting, and a stubbornness that ran the length of his spine. He'd refined his welding as a teenager while his friends were playing hockey and baseball. He'd done job shop work for a local implement maker named Pete Anderson. He kept his cows and his chickens and farmed the same way his father had. And in the back of his mind, walking that headland with the stone boat behind him, the idea had already started to take shape. If you could get a tractor to do this, to keep moving, to scoop the rock up off the ground without stopping, to carry it without a man bending over it, you'd change the worst job on every farm in the country. He was 30 years old. He had no engineering degree. He had a red hip-roof barn out behind the house, a welder, and a wife named Eileen who, between them, would build the company that did exactly what he'd imagined. Chapter 2. The Barn at Raymore. Wilf Degelman was born in Raymore on the 7th of August, 1930. He came up on the family farm at the edge of the Touchwood Hills, in the long shadow of the Depression that had come down on the prairie like a second winter. The dust storms of the 30s were the texture of his childhood. The price of wheat in those years was the texture of his father's worry. By the time he was a teenager, he had figured out something that not many farm boys figure out so early. He wanted to make things, more than he wanted to grow them. He learned to weld in his teens, the way prairie men learned most things in that era, by doing it. He took job shop work from a local implement maker by the name of Pete Anderson, picking up small contracts and patching up other people's machines, and refining a hand that would get more and more steady as the years went on. While his friends played hockey on the slough ice and baseball on the diamond behind the school, Wilf was in a shop somewhere, learning the difference between a bead that would hold and a bead that wouldn't. His sons would later put it more bluntly. The man had no formal training. He had a feel for steel. He married Eileen. They took on the family farm, kept cattle and chickens, and lived the life that the country had laid out for them. And he kept thinking about the rock picker. The first attempts didn't fly. They were too light. They jammed. They missed the rocks they were meant to catch, or they caught them and lost them, or they caught them and bent. Wilf went back into the barn, the red hip-roof barn that stood out behind the house, and welded it again, heavier this time, with a different reel, with the grill at a different angle. It would take him roughly 4 iterations to reach something that worked. In 1962, in that barn, he built the first one that did. A reel-type rock picker that didn't require the tractor to stop. A machine that you drove at a steady pace down the headland, lowered the grill, scooped up the stone, and contained it in the bucket behind you. The motion of the reel turned the stones up over the grill, the way a combine's reel turns the wheat over the cutter bar. The simplicity was the genius of it. There was nothing to break that you couldn't weld back together in your own shop. The first unit was sold to a neighbor in 1964. It was painted green. Not John Deere green by any deliberate choice. Not company green of any kind. Wilf had painted it green, his son Paul would say years later, because green was the only paint he'd found in the barn. The color of the company's first machine had been chosen by what happened to be sitting on the shelf. The neighbor took it home and used it, and word started moving. The next customer wouldn't even wait for Wilf to paint his unit. Dad sold the unit, Paul would remember, with a gallon of his yellow paint for them to apply at home. There is a small detail here that captures the entire decade. The man who would build a company that today ships heavy implements to 7 continents was, in 1964, sending machines out unpainted with a gallon of yellow in the back of the customer's truck because the customer was in too much of a hurry to wait. He needed money to keep building. He sold off the cows and the chickens. He took a large loan from the Bank of Montreal, which his sons would later describe as a great risk for a young father and husband, and a step that older men in the district shook their heads at. He bought steel. Eileen ordered more steel. She kept the books on the kitchen table. She cooked for the welders who lodged at the house while Wilf was scaling up the operation. Jack Degelman, the youngest son, would say of his mother in later years that she was the protector of Wilf and even tougher than him. You'd have to go through Eileen to get to Wilf. She could say no to anyone. She also ran the gate, the men at the door asking to see Wilf, the salesmen, the suppliers, the neighbors wanting a machine. They went through Eileen first. Wilf was usually welding. The advertising was $25 a week in the Western Producer, the prairie farm paper that lived on every kitchen table from Lethbridge to the Pas. $25 ads. A small line drawing of the machine. A phone number out of Raymore. A promise that the picker did what it said it did. The orders came in slowly at first, and then less slowly. Wilf and Jack and Paul, and later Roland and Scott, the 4 sons who would become known around the district as part of the Degelman Five with their sister Leanne, started working farm shows. They took the picker on a trailer to the regional exhibitions. They stood with it under the prairie sun, and they talked to farmers, and the farmers stood beside them and ran their hands over the welds, and the farmers, in time, came back the next year with their checkbooks. Chapter 3. What the ice left. To understand why a self-taught welder from Raymore could build the company he did, you have to understand what's under his field. 20,000 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet sat across what would one day be Canada like a continent of its own. It was kilometers thick in places. It carried, in its slow, southward grinding, everything that fell into it: sand, gravel, cobbles, boulders the size of houses. When the ice retreated, somewhere between 10 and 17,000 years ago, It didn't take any of that with it. It set it down. The whole of the southern prairies, from the Manitoba escarpment to the Alberta foothills, was paved with glacial till, and into that till the ice had scattered what geologists call erratics. The word is from the Latin errare, to wander. A glacial erratic is a stone that wandered. It came from somewhere else, sometimes a long way else, and the ice carried it here. Saskatchewan has erratics the size of small mountains. There is a megablock in the south of the province that measures 30 kilometers by 38 kilometers and lies up to 100 meters thick. Alberta's most famous erratic, the Okotoks Big Rock, weighs 16,500 tons and was carried roughly 930 kilometers from somewhere near what is now Jasper. The prairie sits on top of all of this. The wheat grows in the till that the ice left behind, and the till, every spring, gives up another harvest. This is the part that visitors to the prairie have trouble believing. The rocks don't stop coming. Every winter, the frost in the soil works at them. The ground freezes from the top down. The water in the ground expands. And the smaller stones get pushed upward by the same forces that buckle the highway in March. By the time the field is cultivated in the spring, there are new ones at the surface that weren't there last year. Older prairie generations have a saying for this. They say the country grows rocks. The next generation says it less fondly. They call the stones leverites. Lever right there. Field stones, boulders, erratics, leverites. The Canadian Prairie has more names for rocks than any English-speaking region on Earth, and there is a reason for that, and the reason is the ice. For the farmer, the rocks were never just a nuisance. They were a tax on every piece of equipment that touched the soil. Tillage tools shattered against them. Cultivator shanks bent. Combine headers broke when they hit one buried below the line of the cut. And it got worse as prairie agriculture changed. Through the 70s and 80s, more and more prairie farmers shifted into pulse crops, lentils, peas, chickpeas, which had to be harvested very close to the ground. A combine taking a crop at 4 inches off the soil was a combine vulnerable to anything the frost had pushed up that year. One hidden boulder could take out a $30,000 header in a single pass. The equipment that had been built for those conditions came mostly from somewhere else, and it had mostly been built without knowing what till felt like. American tractors came down from the assembly lines in Iowa and Illinois on soils that didn't fight back the way Saskatchewan soils did. European harvesters were engineered for the fields of Picardy and Lower Saxony, where the worst threat was a wet harvest, not a buried erratic the size of a coffin. The imported machines weren't bad machines. They were good machines, built for the wrong country. They wore out faster on the prairies than anywhere else on the continent. Wilf Degelman understood this from the seat of his tractor. Most of his designs, his sons would later say, originated from the seat of his tractor. He wasn't sitting in a drafting office in Regina. He was on the headland, bouncing across till, feeling in his spine what was wrong with the equipment somebody else had built for somewhere else. The rock picker had been the first answer. It would not be the last. There was a market on the prairie for machines that knew what the prairie was. There was no market on the prairie for machines that didn't. Wilf, by the middle of the 60s, was the one person standing in the gap. Chapter 4. Heavy iron. By 1965, the demand had outgrown the barn. The Degelman family formally established the company that year, the date that still appears in the official records, even though the first picker had come out of the hip-roof barn 3 years earlier. And the following year, they moved the operation to Regina. The first plant was 11,000 square feet on the edge of the city. Wilf had finally accepted that the company was bigger than what could be done at home. The reason for Regina was labor. There were welders in the capital, more than you could find in a town of 1,200 people 2 hours to the north. There were trucks coming through the city every day. There was a steel supplier 2 blocks from the new building. The move made the company a Regina company, but it didn't change what was being built. The picker was still the picker. The bend at the headland was still the bend at the headland. Wilf still came in at 5:30 in the morning, 6 days a week, with steel shavings in the cuffs of his overalls and a notebook of new ideas in his shirt pocket. In 1969, the company built its first bulldozer blade. It was a sideline at the start. A blade for a tractor, mostly meant for prairie roads in winter, for the long, single-lane gravel roads that ran out from every farmhouse, half a kilometer or sometimes 10 kilometers to the grid road, and which in February could disappear under drifts that nothing in the implement shed could touch. A blade meant you could open your own road. It meant your wife could get to town. It meant the propane truck could get to your tank. The blades would later become, in Paul Degelman's words, a life changer for the country families that lived too far out for the municipal grader. John Deere noticed. There was a problem at John Deere by the late 60s. The company had the tractors, but it didn't have the blades. It had been buying them from another supplier. The supplier was struggling to keep up. Somebody from Deere, somewhere in the chain, picked up a phone in Regina and asked Degelman if they could build blades in John Deere green and ship them with the John Deere serial number. They could. The Regina shop ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. Welders coming and going through the same doors at 6 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 10 at night, thousands of blades. Wilf's first blades had cost about $2,500 each. Some of the blades they ship out of that plant today retail for $100,000. The dozer blade, in the son's words, flourished out of necessity. The necessity being that the country roads of the prairie had to be opened in winter, or people died, and somebody had to build the steel that did it. Degelman became the somebody. Through the 70s, the plant expanded to 50,000 square feet. The product line grew. Cultivators, chisel plows, tillage tools of every kind. The company was no longer one machine. It was a workshop building anything that the prairie needed and the giants weren't paying attention to. The philosophy never changed. It was simple. It was Wilf's, and it remains, 60 years later, painted across the wall of the Regina plant in essentially the same words. Build it right, build it heavy, and build it to last, from top to bottom. He had 3 rules for any new design that came across his bench. He spoke them in the same flat prairie voice he used to talk about the weather. The first rule was, whenever in doubt, add metal. If you weren't sure whether the gauge was thick enough, you made it thicker. If you weren't sure whether the bracing was sufficient, you added another piece. The second rule was that anything which looked too clever was probably too clever. He had a phrase for over-engineered designs that came back from R&D too pleased with themselves. That design, he'd say, is too Swiss watch for me. A Swiss watch was a beautiful thing, but it broke on a Saskatchewan headland. The third rule was that the man buying the machine was the man who would have to fix it in February, in his own shop, with whatever was in his welder. So the welds had to be where a welder could reach them. The parts had to be ones he could replace. The simplicity wasn't a stylistic choice. It was a promise to the customer. The teeth on the picker's grill were made of solid C-Twendo 45 steel, a high-carbon medium-strength steel, stronger than mild plate, with enough flex in it to absorb a hit and spring back rather than snap. Other companies used cheaper steel. Wilf wouldn't. Cheap steel cracked. Cracks meant warranty claims. Warranty claims meant farmers who lost faith. Faith was the asset. Everything else was inventory. Not everything Wilf tried worked. There was a slough pump in the early 70s, a machine for pulling water out of the low spots in fields, marketed under a name that has not aged into dignity. It was called the Super Slough Sucker. It did not sell. His sons would say it took out our R&D for a full year. Wilf shrugged. He moved on. He wasn't scared to fail, Paul said of him later. No one builds stars their entire career, but he sure hit on a few of them. The man would not stop selling, and he would not stop undoing the sales his sons were trying to close. At the farm shows, Jack and Paul ran the booth. They moved inventory. They wrote orders. And then their father would wander up to a farmer in coveralls, get to talking about the rock picker, and within 5 minutes, he'd be describing the new version he was working on in R&D, the heavier grill, the bigger hopper, the improvements he hadn't quite finished yet. The farmer would lower his pen. Maybe he should wait, the farmer would say, until next year. Jack and Paul would watch the sale walk away. Their father would shake the farmer's hand and walk back smiling. He could not help himself. He kept building. By the time he was farming his own land alongside the company, and he never stopped farming, even after the plant employed 300 people. He was running 600 horsepower tractors with air seeders and packers that stretched a full 100 feet from the tractor's nose to the back of the last packer wheel. The neighbors thought he was crazy. He was, by any reasonable measure, 10 years ahead of the country. The country eventually caught up. The country eventually bought what he was building. Chapter 5. The Giants. The country Wilf was selling into in the late 60s and early 70s was not, by any measure, short of implement makers. The Canadian agricultural machinery industry in those years was one of the deepest and proudest in the British Empire that had given birth to it. The giants stood across 2 provinces and 120 years of history. They had names that prairie farmers could recite without looking them up. They had factories that could employ a city. The oldest was Cockshut. James G. Cockshut had founded the Brantford Plough Works in 1877, in the Ontario town that the company would dominate for nearly a century. By the 1940s, Cockshut was something more than a plough company. It was building tractors. In 1946, it released the Model 30, the first modern tractor designed and manufactured in Canada, sold in the company's distinctive red, exported around the world. To own a Cockshut was to own a Canadian tractor, full stop. There were farmers in Saskatchewan who had never owned anything else. There were dealers who had built their lives around the brand. Across the city in Brantford, Massey Harris was older still, a merger of 2 Ontario ploughmakers in 1891, and by the early 20th century, the largest agricultural equipment maker in the British Empire. The Massey name went everywhere the crown had gone. It went to Australia. It went to South Africa. It went to India. It built combines that ran on the wheat fields of every dominion. When Massey merged with the Irish manufacturer Harry Ferguson in 1953 to become Massey Ferguson, the new company was the largest farm equipment maker outside of the United States. Brantford was, in those years, what Detroit was to cars and Hamilton was to steel. It was the engine of a national industry. In Winnipeg, a different kind of story was being written. The versatile story began with a man named Peter Pakosh, who had been born in southeastern Saskatchewan in 1911 and had moved to Toronto as a young man to take a draftsman's job with Massey Harris. The drafting room there had rejected him for the design department. Somebody, somewhere in Massey's offices, decided that this farmer's son from the wrong end of the country wasn't going to be designing tractors. Pakosh quit. He moved to Winnipeg. With his brother-in-law, Roy Robinson, he started building grain augers in his basement, using money his wife Adeline had been saving for a fur coat. The fur coat never got bought. The augers got built. By 1966, the company they founded had pioneered the first mass-produced articulated 4-wheel drive tractor in North America. By the 1970s, Versatile had 70% of the 4-wheel drive tractor market on the continent. 70%. The man Massey Harris had refused was now selling more 4-wheel drives than any farm equipment maker in the country. In 1977, he built a prototype called Big Roy, 600 horsepower, 8 wheels, the largest farm tractor in the world. It was the kind of machine the Prairie produced when it stopped waiting for somebody else's permission to build it. There were others. Canadian Cooperative Implements, CCIL as everyone called it, had been founded in 1944 under a Winnipeg lawyer and farm leader named J.B. Jock Brown. It was a farmer-owned cooperative, an attempt to do for implements what the wheat pools had done for grain. It bought the Gregg manufacturing plant in Winnipeg. It worked out a contract with Cockshut to badge tractors for the cooperative dealers. It built combines. By the mid-60s, it had service depots across the prairies, 50 of them, eventually, from Manitoba to Alberta. Farmers would drive past a John Deere lot to get to a CCIL one, because the cooperative was theirs. The dealer was their neighbor. The whole structure had been built to keep the value on the prairie instead of letting it flow east. Out in Saskatoon, the Sumac family, Emerson and Kenneth, had founded FlexiCoil in the early 1950s. They pioneered the coil packer, then the air seeding system that would change prairie sowing forever. By the 90s, FlexiCoil would be the largest farm machinery manufacturer in the country. In St. Brieuc, Saskatchewan, A farmer named Frank Bourgault was about to start Bourgault Industries, an air drill maker that, like Degelman, had been born out of broken equipment on prairie till. In Yorkton, Saskatchewan, two companies were already building dozer blades and rock pickers. Morris Industries, in business for some decades already, and famous for rod weeders and harrows. And Leon's Manufacturing, run by a man named Leon Malinowski, whose father had opened a blacksmith shop in Bankend in 1937, and who had moved the operation to Yorkton in 1967. Leon's built the same kind of heavy iron Degelman built. They were the closest competitors Wilf had on the continent. This was the country Degelman lived in. A country in which prairie metalwork had its own constellation of stars, and the brightest of them shone out of Brantford and Winnipeg and Yorkton and Regina, with what looked, in the 70s, like permanent light. By the early 80s, Massey Ferguson and White Farm, the company that had absorbed Cockshut in 1969, together employed more than 7,000 workers in Brantford alone, a city of 80,000 people that lived off implement money the way Hamilton lived off steel. Versatile in Winnipeg was running 4 shifts. CCIL had service depots from the Manitoba border to the Rockies. The prairie was, in those years, the heart of a national industry. The factories ran day and night. The farmers came in for parts and stayed for coffee. The dealers' yards were full. Wilf, in his Regina plant, was a small player among the giants. He had 300 employees by the end of the 70s, not 7,000. He had a product line that the giants didn't bother with: the picker, the blade, the heavy harrow, the cultivator. He built what Massey wouldn't, and Cockshut wouldn't, and Versatile wouldn't, and CCIL couldn't. He built short line, in the language of the trade, implements that were too small a market for a full-line tractor maker to bother with, but indispensable to the prairie farmer. Wilf liked it that way. The giants were welcome to the long money. He'd take the deep money, the money the farmer paid for the machine he'd come back to for the next 30 years. It would not last. Standing in 1979, with the dozer blade shifts running through the night, and Massey Ferguson, the largest farm equipment maker outside the United States, and Versatile loading 4-wheel drives onto rail cars headed in every direction, and Cockshut Red still moving across prairie fields. Standing there, looking forward, there was no obvious reason to think the industry that had built Brantford and Winnipeg and the prairie service depots would not stand for another century. The tariff wall that had protected Canadian manufacturing since the national policy of 1879 was still in place. The Crow rate, the freight subsidy that had moved prairie grain since 1897, was still moving prairie grain. The factories that employed 7,000 in Brantford and 1,000 and more in Winnipeg were still building everything they could build, as fast as they could build it. Standing in 1979, you would not have looked at the wider picture and seen what was coming. The Bank of Canada had raised its overnight rate to 13.25% in October of that year. By the following October, with inflation running into double digits, it would be at 14. By December of 1980, it would be at 17.25. The 5-year fixed mortgage would touch 21% in the autumn of 1981. The Farm Credit Corporation's loan rate would hit 16.75%. None of those numbers had been seen on the prairie in any living memory. The men in the boardrooms of the great implement companies were aware of them, certainly, but they had not yet adjusted their plans to assume the world had changed. They believed, in 1979, that what was coming was a bad year or two. What was actually coming was the end of the country they had built. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The country changed in October of 1979, and most people didn't feel it for 3 years. The Bank of Canada raised its overnight rate to 13.25% that month, in a deliberate attempt to break the back of an inflation that had been running away from every government in the West. The mortgage rates moved up behind it. The Farm Credit Corporation rate climbed past 16. The 5-year fixed mortgage touched 21% in the autumn of 1981. A farmer carrying $100,000 of operating debt, the kind of money a half-section grain operation routinely carried by the late 70s, was suddenly paying $21,000 a year in interest before he turned a wheel on the land. The number of Canadian farms fell by about 8% over the next 5 years. The Western producer ran articles, week after week, about families walking away from quarter sections their grandfathers had broken with horses. The implement makers had carried the inventory the farmers had bought on credit. When the credit dried up, the inventory sat. The dealers couldn't sell. The factories couldn't ship. The orders that had filled the 4 shifts at Versatile, and the long lines at Brantford, and the cockshut assembly buildings stopped coming. Combine sales across all American brands fell from 32,246 units in 1979 to 8,402 by 1985, a 74% collapse in 6 years. The first of the giants to break was Massey Ferguson. It happened the way large industrial failures always seem to happen, slowly at first, then very fast. The Toronto-based company, the largest agricultural equipment maker outside the United States, had been carrying debt that the high-rate years made impossible to service. By 1980, the company was no longer solvent on a normal accounting basis. Conrad Black, whose Argus Corporation held the controlling stake, donated his shares to the Massey Ferguson employee pension plans, rather than ride the company down himself. An unusual move that lifted the immediate debt off Argus and left the workers' pensions holding the bag. The Canadian and Ontario governments, looking at a potential loss of more than 7,000 Brantford jobs, mounted a bailout. $250 million of public money. It bought time. It did not buy survival. By 1986, the company was reorganized as Verity Corporation, and the combine business, the Massey side of the operation, the historic core of the company, was spun off into a separate entity called Massey Combines Corporation, loaded with the debt the parent wanted off its books. Massey Combines was insolvent within 2 years. On the 4th of March, 1988, the company was placed into receivership. Some 2,600 workers walked out of the Brantford plant for the last time. The total debts ran between $90 million over asset value by one accounting and $290 million by another. The numbers were close enough that they didn't matter. The factory was finished. Verity moved its headquarters to Buffalo in 1991. The company that had been the largest in the British Empire, that had carried the name Massey across the wheat fields of 3 continents, became an American company in a Buffalo office tower and ceased, at any meaningful level, to exist as a Canadian thing. The other Brantford giant went almost in parallel. White Farm Equipment, which had absorbed Cockshut back in 1969 and had run the merged operation under the White name, sustained heavy losses by 1980 and entered receivership in 1985. Another victim, the trade press said at the time, of the farm economy crisis. The Cockshut name, which had stood on Brantford plows since 1877, had already been gone for 8 years. Between them, Massey Ferguson and Cockshut White had employed over 7,000 workers in Brantford in the early 80s. By the end of 1988, the city's unemployment rate stood at 24%, almost a quarter of the working-age population of an 80,000-person city, without a paycheck. The brownfields that the factories left behind sat for years afterwards. Contaminated soil, the bones of foundries, sumac, and goldenrod pushing up through the loading bays. A century of Ontario implement making ended in a single decade. The Canadian cooperative implement story was quieter and just as final. CCIL, the farmer-owned cooperative out of Winnipeg, had spent the late 70s struggling for capital. The interest rate squeeze of the early 80s hit it harder than it hit the bigger players, because the cooperative had no parent to lean on. Its membership couldn't put more money in. The membership was busy losing farms. The manufacturing facilities closed in 1985. The 50 service depots lingered on across the prairies for a while afterwards, slowly winking out, until eventually they were just buildings, empty bays in small prairie towns, the painted CCIL letters fading off the metal. In Regina, 300 kilometers west of nothing that was going under, Wilf Degelman was making blades for John Deere and selling rock pickers to whichever farmers still had cash. He had moved into the 80s with a healthier balance sheet than the giants, in part because he had never gone public and never taken on the kind of debt that a Massey or a Versatile carried. He had not built tractors. He had not tried to compete on volume. He had built short line. The short line market shrank in the rate years, but it did not vanish, because farmers who still had farms still needed rock pickers, and the rock pickers Wilf had sold them 10 years earlier were still working, which was the whole basis of the brand. He was watching, though. The men he had known at Massey for years, the men he had sold to at Cockshut, the men at White. Those men were losing their jobs in 1985 and 1986 and 1987. The trade press was full of obituaries. Wilf, sitting in his office in Regina, was old enough by now to understand what he was seeing. He was 56 years old in 1986. He had built his company in a country that was disappearing. What came next would not be a question of interest rates. Chapter 7. Free Trade and the Crow. On the 2nd of January 1988, in a ceremony at the Prime Minister's residence in Ottawa and another in Washington, Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan signed the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement. The agreement came into force on the 1st of January 1989. NAFTA, which extended the same arrangement to Mexico, was signed in 1992 and took effect on the 1st of January 1994. The agreement did not close any factories that day. What it did was remove the wall, the tariff wall that had stood, in one form or another, since John A. Macdonald's national policy of 1879. For 110 years, that wall had given Canadian manufacturing the protection it needed to operate at smaller volumes, with higher costs, in a colder country, against American competitors who had 10 times the domestic market. The wall came down gradually. Gradually, the factories followed. The mechanism was straightforward. American parent companies that had operated Canadian branch plants, and a great deal of Canadian manufacturing was branch plant manufacturing, now had no reason to keep two production lines running on either side of the border. The Canadian line was smaller. The Canadian costs were higher. The Canadian winter was longer. The branch plants closed. The work moved south. David Peterson, who had been the Liberal Premier of Ontario in the lead-up to the agreement and who had opposed it, would say years afterwards that we lost 200,000 manufacturing jobs in the first 2 years. The figure was disputed. The direction was not. For the agricultural implement makers, the consequences arrived in a different shape. Versatile, the Winnipeg four-wheel drive maker that had dominated its segment, had already been sold once by then, to Cornat Industries of Vancouver in 1977, and from Cornat to Ford New Holland in 1987. After the sale to Ford, the Versatile name was, in the words of the trade press, all but disappeared beneath the Ford logo. When the Case New Holland merger of 1999 created CNH, regulators forced a divestiture of the Versatile line. It went to Bühler Industries of Winnipeg. In 2007, Russia's Rostelmash acquired 80% of Bühler. The versatile tractors that had been built by a Saskatchewan-born draftsman in his Winnipeg basement, financed with money his wife had saved for a fur coat, were now built under foreign ownership for a foreign market. Peter Pakosh's company had survived. It had not survived as itself. Then there was the Crow. The Crow's Nest Pass Agreement of 1897 had been one of the foundational subsidies of prairie agriculture. It capped the freight rates that the Canadian Pacific Railway could charge for hauling grain from the prairies to the lakehead at Thunder Bay, in exchange for federal support of the line through the Crow's Nest Pass in British Columbia. The cap had been modified over the decades. In 1983, the Western Grain Transportation Act replaced the original Crow rate, capping rate increases at 10% of world price and shifting most of the subsidy onto the federal government, which paid the railways directly, roughly $660 million a year by the early 90s. In the 1995 federal budget, in a deficit-cutting exercise driven by an Ottawa convinced that the country had run out of money, the Crow benefit was abolished. Freight costs for grain farmers doubled, and in some cases tripled, during 1995 and 1996. There was a one-time payout, roughly $1.5 billion, to soften the landing. It softened nothing. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the New World Trade Organization had taken the view that the Crow was an illegal export subsidy. Saskatchewan's Premier Roy Romanow forecast that provincial net farm income would drop by $320 million a year. He was, in the event, optimistic. What free trade and the end of the Crow did, taken together, was finish what the rate years of the early 80s had started. The Canadian implement industry of 1979, the 7,000 workers in Brantford, the 4 shifts in Winnipeg, the 50 CCIL service depots, was being dismantled, one mechanism at a time. The full-line tractor and combine makers were the first to go. The short-line makers, the smaller specialists who had occupied the niches the giants didn't bother with, were left standing in a country that had been organized around the giants. Wilf Degelman, in Regina, was about to discover that he was not, in fact, safe. Chapter 8. Almost. The story of why Degelman did not fall in the mid-90s has been told, inside the company, with a particular phrase that Paul Degelman has used more than once over the years. We were having a tough time making payroll. It is a quiet phrase. It does not appear in the company's marketing material. It does not appear on the wall of the Regina plant. But it is the phrase that captures the moment when the company that had survived the 80s came very close to going under in the 90s, for reasons that had little to do with interest rates and everything to do with the way the prairie itself was changing. The change was no-till. Through the late 80s and into the 90s, prairie agriculture was undergoing the biggest shift in its working method since the tractor had replaced the horse. The old way, summer fallowing, repeated tillage, plowing the soil over and over to control weeds and conserve moisture, was being abandoned. The new way was no-till, also called zero-till or direct seeding, an approach that left the previous year's stubble in place, planted the new crop directly through it with air seeders, and controlled weeds with herbicide rather than steel. The soil benefits were enormous. Erosion dropped. Moisture conservation improved. The carbon stayed in the ground. But for Degelman, which had spent decades building its income on cultivators and chisel plows and the heavy tillage equipment a summer fallowing farm depended on, no-till was a slow extinction event. The orders for tillage equipment shrank. Then they shrank some more. By the early 90s, Degelman could see what was coming. In the early 90s, the company exited tillage. It got out of the cultivator and chisel plow business that had carried much of its volume for 20 years. The remaining product lines, the rock picker, the dozer blade, were not enough to fill the plant. This is the period the family does not like to talk about. The number of welders on the floor came down. The account strained. Paul Degelman, in the office, with the books open, would sit with his brothers and look at what was coming in and what was going out, and discuss whether they could make the next 2 weeks. 2 things saved the company. The first was the land roller, introduced in 1992 and 1993, a heavy steel drum towed across the field after seeding that pushed combine-damaging rocks below the surface rather than removing them. It was a rock solution that worked in a no-till world. Pulse crop farmers, the lentil and pea growers harvesting at 4 inches off the ground, took to it immediately. The second was the Strawmaster. The Strawmaster was a heavy harrow, developed in roughly 1993 to 1995, designed to manage the heavy stubble that no-till left in the field. The whole logic of no-till was to keep the stubble in place. The practical problem was that the stubble could be too heavy in places, too thick to seed through. The Strawmaster combed the residue across the field, sized the trash, prepared the seedbed without disturbing the soil structure. It did exactly what no-till farmers needed and could not otherwise get. Within 4 years of its introduction, Degelman was selling 600 units a year. The company that had been counting fortnights was, by 1998, building a queue of orders it could not fill fast enough. The Strawmaster did not save Degelman by accident. The company survived because Wilf and his sons made the decision, against the natural instinct of every business, to walk away from the product line that had built them, the tillage tools, and to bet what was left on a machine that fit the new world rather than the old one. They had reread the prairie. They had built the new machine the prairie needed. It was the way Wilf had always worked, from the seat of the tractor. Most of his designs originated from the seat of his tractor. The seat had changed. The designs had to follow. By the late 90s, with the Strawmaster running through the plant in 600-unit years, and the rock picker still selling, and the dozer blade still going out the door in John Deere green, the company was past the squeeze. Wilf was approaching 70. The day-to-day management had long since shifted to Paul and Jack, with Roland and Scott earlier, and Leanne in the office. The four of them ran the company on what, around the family table, was sometimes called the "what would Wilf do" principle. There was no formal succession plan. There was no playbook. There was the question, asked when a decision was difficult, and the answer that the four of them had heard their father give to that question for 35 years. Add metal. Don't get too Swiss watch. Trust the customer in his February shop. They had nearly lost it. They had not lost it. And around them, the country that had built Massey Ferguson and Cockshut and CCIL was about to lose what it had left. Chapter 9. The Last to Fall. In January 2000, FlexiCoil, the Saskatoon company the Sumac family had founded in the early 50s, the air seeder pioneer that by 1995 had been the largest farm machinery manufacturer in Canada with more than 1,200 employees, became the property of CNH Global. New Holland had bought 35% in 1997. The full acquisition closed on the 4th of January, 2000. The Sumac name disappeared from the masthead. The plant continued operating, but under foreign ownership, as a piece of a multinational. Another prairie company had finished its independent life. Degelman, by then, had launched into a new phase. The Pro-Till high-speed disc, a vertical tillage tool that worked with the no-till logic rather than against it, came out in 2010 and quickly became the largest single product line in the plant. The workforce was passing 300, then 400. The company had a plant in Hillsboro, North Dakota, supplying the American market. The dealer network ran across the prairies, into the United States, and across the Atlantic into Germany and the United Kingdom, and then into Australia and Kazakhstan, and South Africa, and Russia, and Ukraine, and China. The rock picker was being shipped, in some years, to places where the soil had been broken by retreating European glaciers, rather than Laurentide ones, but where the principle was the same. There was labor trouble in those years, and it would be dishonest not to mention it. The workers at the Regina plant had joined the United Steelworkers in 2000. There was a brief strike in 2004. In 2013, a contract dispute escalated into a lockout that put about 150 Degelman workers on the picket line through a Saskatchewan winter. The temperature on the line dropped to -40. The workers stayed. "The guys are pretty determined," the USW's Sonny Ryu told reporters at the time, "out here in 40 below weather, and prepared to stay." The dispute reached a tentative agreement after several weeks. Both sides came out wounded. Both sides came back to work. What Degelman did not have in those years was a buyer from outside the prairie wanting to absorb it. There was no Ford. There was no Buhler. The family had refused offers across the decades. They had stayed in Regina. They had stayed independent. The same could not be said for the other Yorkton makers. Morris Industries was the older of the two, a company that had been making rod weeders, deep tillage tools, harrows and air carts out of Yorkton since 1949. By the late 2010s, Morris was in trouble. There had been warranty problems with its quantum air drill in the Australian market. There was high debt. In January 2020, the company filed for creditor protection. The Bank of Montreal, the principal secured creditor, was owed about $25 million, with another $6.5 million in interim financing. Through the year, Morris looked for a buyer. In December 2020, the assets were sold to Right Way Manufacturing, the Saskatchewan air seeder and tillage maker now operating under the Superior Farm Solutions umbrella. The Yorkton plant, where Morris had built its products for 71 years, was excluded from the deal. It closed. 70 people lost their jobs, 20 active workers, 50 who had already been laid off and were waiting for word that didn't come. The RWDSU local in Yorkton had approved a wind-down agreement at an open-air meeting at a baseball diamond because the Union Hall couldn't accommodate the social distancing requirements of the COVID year. A handful of pictures from that meeting circulated afterwards. Men in coveralls standing in the spring grass of a Saskatchewan ball field, voting on the end of a Yorkton company. 4 years later, the other Yorkton maker fell. Leon's Manufacturing, Leon Malinowski's company, the one that had started in his father Stanley's blacksmith shop in Bankend in 1937 and that had moved to Yorkton in 1967, had spent the years building the same kind of heavy iron Degelman built: dozer blades, rock pickers, loaders. There had been complaints in the trade for some time before the end. Customers who had paid deposits for equipment that hadn't been delivered, dealers who couldn't get returned calls, a slow erosion of the trust that the company had once enjoyed. On the 11th of June 2024, Leon's was placed in receivership at the application of the Bank of Montreal, with Ernst & Young as receiver. The bank, the receivership filing read, says the named companies owe over $16.6 million. The bankruptcy filings would show total liabilities of nearly $19 million. The company was immediately closed. The assets were auctioned over 2 days in late October 2024. The affiliated Ram Industries, a hydraulic cylinder maker founded by the Malinowski family in 1973, collapsed alongside it. Ram's assets were sold to Parkland Welding and Machine in February 2025. The Yorkton plant, where Leon Malinowski had built dozer blades for 47 years, was, by the spring of 2025, the property of an auctioneer. The closest competitor Degelman had ever had was gone. In Brantford, the brownfields that had been Massey and Cockshut had spent the better part of 2 decades being remediated and redeveloped. Some of the old plant footprint was a Walmart by then. Some of it was condominiums. Some of it was still vacant, the grass coming up through the cracked concrete, the chain-link fence going rusty around the edge of what had once been the foundry yard. In Winnipeg, the old CCIL service depots had become, variously, a tile shop and a tire dealership and a vacant lot. In Yorkton, the Morris plant sat empty through the winter of 2020 to 2021, snow drifting up against the loading bays where there were no longer any trucks. The Leon's plant, by 2025, was being walked through by auction buyers. The country that Wilf Degelman had built his company in had gone. The factory in Regina was still running. Chapter 10. Still here. In the autumn of 2019, a private equity transaction closed in Regina that the family had been working toward for years. Westcap Mine, a Saskatoon firm that specialized in management buyouts of Saskatchewan companies, syndicated with the Golden Opportunities Fund, made a $63 million investment in a Degelman management buyout. 6 Degelman managers, including a man named Blair Flavel, who had started as a production worker at the plant 40 years earlier and who would take over as president, became co-owners. The deal closed at the end of 2019 and was formally announced in January 2020. The structure mattered. The Degelman family did not sell out. The Degelman family retained ownership. Family members continued, and continue, to sit on the board. What the deal did was bring in outside capital to fund the next stage of growth, to expand the management ownership beyond the bloodline, and to formalize a succession that had been working informally since Wilf had stepped back. The family still has ownership, Mike Lessiter would write in Farm Equipment in 2024, and family members sit on the board. It is not the simple one-family company it once was. It is a more complicated thing, a family-controlled business, with management ownership and a Saskatchewan private equity partner. The thing that did not change was the address. The plant is at 272 Industrial Drive in Regina, about 200,000 square feet now, with another 30,000 in Hillsboro, North Dakota. The workforce is over 500. In 2023, the company acquired Wren Mill Center, a grain handling equipment maker in Lacombe, Alberta, and the combined operation passed the 500-employee mark. The rock pickers go out the door in the company's current orange. The Pro-Till discs are now the largest product line. The Strawmaster harrows that saved the company in the mid-90s are still being built, in updated forms, in the same plant. The dozer blades are still going out in John Deere green. 3 hours west and slightly north, in the village of St. Brieuc, Saskatchewan, Bourgault Industries is still operating and still owned by the Bourgault family. The 2 Prairie companies, founded a decade apart out of the same machine-destroying problem in the same till, are the 2 great survivors of the Canadian short-line industry. They built tough. They stayed independent. Frank Bourgault and Wilf Degelman were never partners and were occasionally competitors, but they were doing, in their separate plants, the same essential thing. building for the country that was actually outside the window, not the country someone in Iowa or Illinois imagined. Wilf is in his 90s now. The Farm Equipment Shortline Legends Hall of Fame profile in 2024 found him at home with his daughter Leanne in Saskatchewan, 94 years old. He had built his first machine in a barn that was painted red, with green paint that happened to be in the corner, and a wife at the kitchen table who kept the books on a clipboard. He had taken a loan from the Bank of Montreal that no one in his district thought he should take. He had built rock pickers that were still working on Saskatchewan fields 30 and 40 years after they were sold, which was, as his U.S. sales manager Jason Faulkner put it, the most important thing about Degelman, that we always overbuild our products so that they will stand the test of time. There were farmers, Faulkner said, still using Degelman rock pickers that were made 30 years ago. The Saskatchewan still grows rocks. The Laurentide ice sheet has not stopped giving up what it left here. Every spring, the frost works the smaller stones up to the surface, and every summer the prairie continues, in the old language, to grow them. The combines still hit them at 4 inches off the ground. The headers still break. And the rock pickers from the Regina plant, the ones being welded right now under the company's orange paint by men whose grandfathers may have worked at Massey or Cockshut or White, the ones being loaded onto trucks bound for North Dakota and Germany and Kazakhstan, those pickers are still doing what Wilf's first picker did in 1964. The reel turns. The grill takes the stone. The hopper holds it. The machine keeps moving, and the tractor doesn't stop. Chapter 11. What the Country Keeps. There is an instinct in a story like this to look for the lesson, to explain what the survival proves, or what the country should have done differently to keep the other plants running, or what the next generation can learn from the way one Saskatchewan family welded its way through a half-century of structural collapse. The instinct is the wrong one. The story does not produce a lesson. It produces a place. The place is Regina, on Industrial Drive, where a plant has been running since 1966, and where 500 people will arrive at the gate tomorrow morning in the cold and the dark of a prairie winter, and start the welders up and begin building, on a Monday in the middle of nowhere in particular, the heavy iron that the country needs, because the ice put rocks under the wheat. The place is also Raymore, where a hip-roof barn stood for a long time, and may still, the red one out behind the house, where a self-taught welder named Wilf Degelman built his first picker, because his back hurt from picking stones by hand, and he had decided he was done with that. The eulogist's voice that this story has been told in, the voice that mourned Massey Ferguson and Cockshut and Versatile and Co-op implements and the 7,000 jobs in Brantford and the 50 service depots and the Morris plant in Yorkton with its loading bays going empty in the snow and the Leon's plant down the road in the same town a few years later. That voice is not the right voice for the last paragraph. The last paragraph belongs to the prairie itself, to the country that still grows rocks, to the welder coming in for the early shift, lunch in one hand, gloves in the other, his breath freezing in the air between his car and the door, to the steel on the rack inside, waiting to be cut, to the orange paint on the line, to the order book on the foreman's desk, Kazakhstan, North Dakota, Alberta, Ukraine, the next county over, to the picker that will be loaded onto a truck on Friday, and that will be in a field somewhere east of Yorkton on the following Tuesday, taking the stones the ice left behind, doing the work that Wilf saw needed doing on a summer afternoon in the late 50s when he was bending over a stone boat and thinking there had to be a better way. There was. He built it. He kept building it. His family kept building it. And on a Monday morning in Regina, in the still cold light of a prairie winter, they are building it now.